How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most limp podcast in the world. We're your hosts, as always, myself, Mickey T.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of the Albums Recap Series, where we talk about a bunch of albums that came out during a certain month, and this time we're back with Spooky Month. We're back with October, and there's some scary fucking albums here with some scary-ass reviews to go with them, just to say the least. And, yeah, I'm sure all of you guys know the drill by now, and yeah, we're going to get started. So, first album that we're going to be talking about today is Colourgrade by Tirzah. This is the sophomore album from the UK singer and songwriter Tirzah Mastin, aka Tirzah. Now, I'm very new to Tirzah's work. I haven't checked out any of her work prior to this album, and this is the first taste of her music that I'm getting. I wasn't sure as to what her whole vibe was, and I didn't really have that much expectations going into it. And now that I've given it a shot, I'm just kind of baffled at the fact that this got Best New Music from Pitchfork, because I'm just going to be blunt, I think this album is bad. I don't like it, and I think it's one of the most ill-conceived, directionless, and dull albums that I've heard all year. You know, I could get people gravitating towards this album for its experimental nature, and I can appreciate some of the originality, but to be honest, it's just such a mess of a project in my opinion, and that's in terms of both sound and focus. And the worst sin that it commits is that it's just frustratingly boring. The synthetic sound palette and the production on Colourgrade is just so weak. It's incredibly skeletal, very dull tonally, and there's just no colour to this album. Like, it's just plain grey. Not to mention, I just feel like there's no direction or progression with most of the tracks on here. They just drone along with no purpose, and they don't really reach any sort of satisfying or interesting highs. It's just kind of plodding along aimlessly, and it achieves nothing. You know, Tirzah's vocals are present throughout the whole album as well, but she doesn't really add much of anything interesting to the sound palette of the whole thing, in my opinion. In fact, they're often very manipulated, and like very low-key vocals only add to the monotony of the album for me. Like, she's not awful, but she's just incredibly bland on already bland instrumentals. The album does pick up a tad bit with the last few tracks, but by then it's too late, because it's just already enough of a slog to sit through, and it continues to be, since, you know, these few tracks just are fine. So yeah, I won't go on any further. I didn't really enjoy what Tirzah presented on Colourgrade. It was just so bland and colourless, and overall just very unfocused and dull. It's probably one of my least favourite albums of the latter half of the year, and while I can respect the artistic intent, I just didn't connect with it at all.
You absolutely cannot fault Colourgrade for, you know, playing it safe or not attempting anything new. You know, there's really not another album I've heard this year that sounds like this project. But is the execution as effective as the ideas are interesting? No, not really. There's tracks on here that mix Tirzah's very comforting and mellow vocals with just very harsh and sparse instrumentation in a very captivating way, but there's just a fair bit of tracks on here that to me personally just feel like throwaways. The title track, for example, just goes absolutely nowhere interesting. Its experimentation gets tired after one listen, and it just doesn't do absolutely anything for the entirety of the album. But then there's tracks like Hive Mind or Recipe, which I do find really engaging. So while, you know, it is a little hit or miss, I do think that, you know, when the ideas that Tirzah does attempt, you know, are well executed, I think she does have something here that I enjoy. But, you know, when you have tracks like Crepuscular Rays, which honestly just sounds like some sort of sound test that was just placed in the album by accident, it's hard to really enjoy this whole project as a one cohesive unit. Even though I do appreciate the experimentation, I do appreciate the very cryptic, the mellow and sparse atmosphere. It's just a hard project for me to get into.
Fair enough, I guess. My favourite track from Colourgrade is Send Me. The worst tracks are Tectonic and Sleeping, and I gave this album a decent 3.
My favourite tracks are Hive Mind, Recipe, and Hips. My least favourite tracks are Colourgrade and Crepuscular Rays, and I gave this album a light 6.
Okay, moving on, we have The Quest by Yes. This is the 22nd studio album from the pioneering UK progressive rock and symphonic prog band Yes. A Yes album in 2021 with none of the original members on this album? How fun. In reality, though, I haven't heard that many Yes albums aside from Close to the Edge, which is an amazing album, an absolute classic in the world of prog, and one that I would definitely recommend you guys check out. But the prospect of a new album from a prog band long past their prime was a bit of a non-starter for me, and considering that the band have none of the original members anymore, I was just expecting it to be just another glorified Yes cover band album. And I'd like to think I was right, because in all honesty, this just feels like a parody of Yes and their sound, honestly. You know, I mean, it's produced well, so I guess that's a big bonus to this album's benefit, and it's performed competently, but that's just about it, really, since the quest is quite mediocre. You know, the ideas that the band explore in here come off either dated or underdeveloped and repetitive. The instrumentation doesn't really do anything for me. It doesn't really have that much interesting going on with their respective tracks, and oftentimes the songwriting ranges from average to god-awful. You know, the opening track is cool, I guess, and there's a few other pleasant moments here and there, but it's mostly forgettable, and it just leaves very little impact on me. I would say more, but I well and truly have nothing else to say about it. It's a new Yes album. It's a new Yes album.
Yeah, this feels a bit like a fever dream, because coming from someone who hasn't listened to a single Yes album released in the last 40 years, I definitely have missed a fair bit of context there, and connecting the dots between this album and, you know, the classics that I have heard is just a little confusing. The excitement of the band's formative years obviously just no longer is there, and honestly, if I'm being honest, I didn't expect much better. In fact, you know, I did come away with some enjoyable moments, and that was perhaps a little more than I expected. But you know, while it's not downright bad, I think it's just so safe, so sterile that, you know, at times it just borders on novelty. It really isn't an album I'm ever going to go out of my way to listen to. But at the same time, it really wasn't an album that I, you know, had a hard time sitting through. It sounds very safe, and as I said, it just borders on novelty. It's just so generic.
Alright, my favourite tracks from The Quest are The Ice Bridge and Music to My Ears. The worst track is Mystery Tour, and I gave this album a decent 4.
My favourite tracks are Dare to Know and Minus the Man. My least favourite track is Future Memories, and I gave this album a I almost said a light 10. A light 5 out of 10. That would have been the biggest
Yes album's a 10.
biggest plot twist of the year.
Oh, Jesus. Alright, next up we have Friends That Break Your Heart by James Blake. This is the 5th studio album from UK producer, singer and songwriter James Blake. This album is coming out 2 years after his last album, Assume Form, which was my introduction to James Blake, and I like that album. I think it's a good effort from James, and it has some really great tracks to its name for me. With this new album, though, I was pretty hyped to hear it. I think that the singles were pretty good, and I was hopeful that we'd get another very good album from James, and while I think that Friends That Break Your Heart is a flawed album, I feel like it has some emotional merit to it lyrically. You know, lyrically, this album is essentially just James exploring his broken friendships and how the ends of these friendships have affected him throughout the album. I feel like James is well able to express, you know, these thoughts and feelings incredibly well, and I feel like the emotional potency and weight in his music is one of its main key strengths, I would say. You know, he absolutely shines in expressing the emotional devastation and anguish that comes with dealing with these feelings, but where it thrives in its emotional potency, it lacks in compelling sonic direction, since the ambient pop setting that Blake kind of boxed himself into became very stale for me. Now, there's some really good instrumentals on here that are incredibly lush and sound amazing, don't get me wrong, but majority of the time I just don't feel invested in the production and what James tries to do here creatively, since it's more or less what I've heard from him already, with nothing that really sets itself apart as something interesting. Plus, at times I can just feel like it feels very dull, and James himself carries vocally and lyrically with I guess he just carries these instrumentals. I don't have too much to say about this album. It's definitely got some decent qualities about it. Obviously, like the songwriting, which honestly is very strong in this album. But I don't know, the production didn't really do him any service, and unfortunately, I just think it's an alright album. It's just okay.
Yeah, I'm certainly quite fond of James Blake and his signature alternative R&B style. And Friends That Break Your Heart, I think the biggest problem with this album is just how little it surprises and how little it deviates from what I come to expect from James Blake. You know, I do think that, you know, a lot of the time James is playing to his strengths, and obviously it definitely doesn't make for some. It definitely makes for some safe but enjoyable moments. It doesn't really surprise me. It doesn't shock me. It just is a pretty clean James Blake album. If you like James Blake, I mean, there's zero reason not to enjoy this, but it's not going to be something that, you know, sells people that are on the fence. It's not going to be something that will go down as one of his finest moments. But you know, it's not like he's phoning in the most bottom of the barrel, just easiest to make material possible. There is definitely some merit to this project, but you know, would I listen to this project over something like Assume Form? Probably not. It's enjoyable, it's well assembled, but I don't think it's going to be an album that I look back at, you know, with fond memories. It's solid.
Yeah, I agree. My favourite tracks from Friends That Break Your Heart are Coming Back, Say What You Will, and If I'm Insecure. My least favourite track is Frozen, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favourite tracks are Famous Last Words, Frozen, and Say What You Will. My least favourite track is Funeral, and I gave this album a decent 6.
Okay, moving on, we're going to move on to Talk Memory by Bad Bad Not Good. This is the 6th studio album from the Canadian jazz fusion band Bad Bad Not Good. Bad Bad Not Good are a band that I've been meaning to check out for a hot minute now, ever since I heard about them from that version of the Denzel Curry song Ultimate that they did, which was really cool, in my opinion. Plus, when I saw what kind of music that they made and, you know, who they collaborated with in the past, I had all the incentive to go and check out their music, but I just never did until now with Talk Memory. Well, it's out now, I've listened to it a few times, and yeah, I think it's pretty good if you ask me. Now, throughout this completely instrumental album, we get 8 tracks of very good jazz fusion that has the good compositional prowess and technicality to back it up, plus they showcase a fair amount of diversity with what they do instrumentally, since they incorporate some chamber jazz instrumentation as well as some ideas revolving around spiritual jazz, and for most of the tracks, they pull it off well. The production on this album is really solid, it's very crisp, it does justice to the instrumentals, and it's executed with such finesse in my opinion, especially on my favourite tracks. You know, the drumming and the sax especially are just great all throughout this album, and they constantly stood out to me. I don't think it's a perfect album though, there are a few tracks here that kind of feel a bit unmemorable and not all that engaging. They either drag on for too long or don't really do anything that spectacular, and while they aren't bad or even mediocre, they're just not very noticeable for me. But hey, besides that, I think this album was really good. I think it has some really great tracks on it. I think it's a really good introduction to their work, and I'm interested in checking out more of it.
Yeah, I personally owe a lot to Bad Bad Not Good. Their 2011 medley of Zelda covers and ultimately the debut album that came out that year was my first entry into the world of jazz. And while, you know, since then I've heard plenty of material a lot more ambitious and incredible within the jazz sphere, I think the band's, you know, relative accessibility, especially to hip-hop heads, is definitely a plus and something that the band have kind of strayed away with on this project. It definitely feels a little more vibrant, a little more out there, and just eclectic overall. And I really love this direction that they're going in. I love, you know, the fact that they're expanding their horizons within the jazz sphere. This new chamber jazz direction, it's really fresh for the group. I think they execute it perfectly. And, you know, it's just overall, I think an album which I think propels them into the more classic jazz sphere rather than just kind of sitting on the fence between instrumental hip-hop and jazz like they did in their early years. And yeah, I definitely really enjoyed this album. And, you know, inviting a jazz legend like Arthur Verocai to work with them throughout this project is just a testament to how important the band is in the jazz sphere today. Talk Memory is great. It's one of the most enjoyable jazz records I've heard this year. And yeah, I'm a fan of the band, and this isn't going to stop anything.
Okay, my favourite tracks from Talk Memory are Signal from the Noise, City of Mirrors, Love Proceeding, and Talk Meaning. My least favourite tracks are Timid and Intimidating, and I gave this album a decent 7.
My favourite tracks are Signal from the Noise, Beside April, and Talk Meaning. Don't really have any least favourites. I gave this album a strong 7.
Okay, moving on, we have Mercurial World by Magdalena Bay. This is the debut album from synthpop duo Magdalena Bay, which consists of singer-songwriter Mika Tenenbaum and producer Matthew Lewin. Magdalena Bay are finally, after coming out with their full-length debut and building up, which they were building up to this point with a bunch of EPs, one of which was my entry point into the group's work, that being A Little Rhythm and A Wicked Feeling, which is a solid EP that has its jams, but it's nothing too crazy for me personally. When I saw the rave reviews for Mercurial World, I thought I was pretty damn excited to say the least, and I was very curious as to what Magdalena Bay, left us to behold on Mercurial World. And after listening to it a few times, I was very surprised and happy with the way Mercurial World turned out, because it's easily the best pop record that I've heard all year. To be fair, Magdalena Bay take from an array of influences, which are often really noticeable, but to be honest, that just doesn't bother me anymore with consecutive listens, because Mercurial World generally just has great performances, great production, and they're just way too top-notch to ignore. To start, I just got to talk about Matthew's production here, which, for lack of better words, is just amazing. A lot of the sounds that the group pull from are done justice from his production, which just sounds immaculate on every track. It sounds lush, it sounds ethereal, it sounds punchy, it combines different sounds here with ease, and the psychedelic textures are always a welcome treat here. Mika's performances are really great on here as well. She matches the sound palette of this album and gives it some personality. Her vocals add a ton to the futuristic vibe of the album, and she's strong on most of these tracks here. The influences of dance pop, synth pop, electropop, chillwave, and contemporary R&B are blended so well together, and all in all, they just create such a fun and infectious atmosphere that's honestly quite addicting. It also has a bit of a throwback flair to some degree. There's definitely some grooves and ideas here that have a vintage sound to them, and they're done incredibly well. This album is just bop after bop, and it has so many memorable and fulfilling pop tracks that are just simply infectious. There isn't a single average track in this thing, and most of them are just bangers, simply put. So yeah, Magdalena Bay absolutely fucking killed it with Mercurial World. It was an incredibly impressive debut from the group, and that's all down to the fantastic production, ideas, and performances. It's easily the best pop record that I've heard all year, and I doubt there'll be another album that'll top it this year for me. So yeah, bop after bop, the album.
Last year's A Little Rhythm and Wicked Feeling was my introduction to the Miami synth-pop duo Magdalena Bay. And while there was definitely plenty to admire about their playful and infectious style on that EP, there really wasn't all too much there that would lead me to believe that just a mere year later they'd be releasing one of the best pop albums of the decade, and here they are. This album's amazing. Everything I look for in pop music is just present in truckloads throughout, and it definitely expands the band's playful, comforting synth-pop style into something much bigger, something far greater than what the EP from last year could have ever hoped to be. On top of just being downright catchy and infectious, which, let's face it, very important when it comes to pop, it manages to do so many interesting and exciting things within that synth-pop style that just has me absolutely glued to the speakers, even after several listens. It's just so comforting, yet so psychedelic and ethereal. The production here is just fantastic. It just like you said, Matthew takes influences from all over the music sphere and just combines them into something so lush. And Mika's performances as well. She has a swagger, like a class about her that just adds to the overall aesthetic of these tracks. Everything comes together perfectly. It blows me away with how effortlessly it blends all these influences. It's a fantastic pop record. It's definitely one of the best albums I've heard this year. One of the best pop albums I've heard this year as well. And sorry for not being hyped about your debut EP. I honestly was not expecting this, but I'm blown away.
Yeah, same here. Holy shit, man. Right, so my favorite tracks from Mercurial World are the title track, Dawning of the Season, Secrets Your Fire, and Prophecy. If I had to pick a least favorite, it would probably be Domino, and I gave this album a decent 8.
My favorite tracks are Dawning of the Season, Secrets Your Fire, and You Lose. Don't really have any least favorite tracks. I give this album a strong 8.
Alright, next up we have 17 Going Under by Sam Fender. This is the sophomore album from UK singer-songwriter Sam Fender, and this is coming out 2 years after his debut, Hypersonic Missiles. I've seen Sam's debut floating around on the internet for a couple of years now, actually, and I haven't given it a listen despite that. But I have heard one song from him in particular, which is Get You Down, a single for this album, and I actually heard it on the new FIFA soundtrack, if you believe it or not, and honestly, I fucking like this song a lot. So, to be honest, when I saw that this album was going to be one that we're covering and instantly remembering the song, I was like, okay, this has potential to be really great. And yeah, I didn't really have that many expectations going into it, like, initially, but when I found out, like, the song was obviously on it, I was like, okay, this could be something. And after listening to it, I think that it's a good album despite its flaws. Now, Sam's sound heavily resides in, like, a Bruce Springsteen-inspired Heartland rock setting, and for me, I feel like Sam was able to do justice to the sound for the most part, and he shows that he has the passion and the strong songwriting to back it up. The production on 17 Going Under is really great to me. Everything sounds balanced, it's texturally rich sounding, and it gives way to some really good, passionate instrumentals. Sam vocally and lyrically matches the instrumentals in the production since he sounds very passionate on this thing. He hits upon some very awe-inducing hooks, and his songwriting ranges from being very outspoken to personal, which gives this album a massive strong point and credit to itself. And despite its inconsistencies, the highs in this album are too outstanding not to notice. But, those inconsistencies are noticeable. I feel like there's a few tracks on here that are just kind of bland. They don't really stand out as much as anything memorable on here. And when compared to the highs that I got from this album, they just don't seem as well crafted or as catchy. Despite that, though, this album has a lot going for it. I feel like Sam did a good job on a lot of fronts here, and he showcases a strong presence that I hope improves over time.
You done?
Yeah.
Sam Fender has been on my radar ever since his single Hypersonic Missiles dropped in early 2019. A single which immediately, caught my attention with its no cutting corners political messaging and its tasteful odes to Heartland rock incorporated into, the overwhelming indie rock style throughout. But, since that track, he's kind of fallen just short of the expectations he set for himself with that track. For me personally, the album that followed it, Hypersonic Missiles, just didn't really live up to the quality I expected going in. And, while I do definitely find a lot of value and a lot of talent present in Sam's work, up to this point, it's just kind of been a mixed bag. And while, this album is definitely a step up in my opinion, I also don't really think it's, reaching the potential that Sam Fender most certainly has. I think he's, definitely established a sound for himself. I think he's one of the probably at the best out of all the artists doing Bruce Springsteen impressions today. I think Sam Fender probably is the best. There's a lot of quality, like genuine quality in his songwriting that is just present throughout. And, the material definitely, I think, lives and dies by the lyrical quality and Sam's performances, because I don't think the instrumentals are that great. They never strike me as memorable. If a song from this album or his previous album gets stuck in my head, it's just because of the vocals and the vocals and songwriting. And I do think that it's a little safe in the instrumental department, which does bring it down a fair bit for me. But I still think that, as I said before, there's a lot of potential here, and I'm just hoping to hear it throughout the years, because Sam is still definitely very young and already making very, very mature music. So excited to see where it goes.
Fair enough. The boss would be proud, I'd say. So yeah. Alright, my favourite tracks from 17 Going Under are the title track, Spit of You, and Get You Down. My least favourite track is Mantra, and I gave this album a decent 7.
My favourite tracks are 17 Going Under, Getting Started, and my least favourite track is Long Way Off. I gave this album a strong 6.
Next up, we have Life of a Don by Don Toliver. This is the sophomore album from the Texas rapper and singer Don Toliver. This album is coming out a year after Don's debut album, Heaven and Hell, which was an okay yet ultimately disappointing debut from him, since I've had high hopes for Don Toliver since he broke into the scene with his amazing feature on Travis Scott's Astroworld, and with his debut mixtape Donny Womack, which I thought was really good. But this new album, I was really hoping Don would be able to step up his game and improve upon his lackluster debut. But unfortunately, Life of Dawn just ends up being a huge setback instead, since it's just a very mediocre project all in all. Life of a Dawn is just another in one ear and out the other situation for me, since there's very little about this album that's all that interesting or compelling in either the production or vocal front, since Dawn is just handing us 50 minutes of uninspired, bland, and boring trap and all R&B. When it comes to the production, I just find most of it to be incredibly bland. The tones are bland, the beats are not standout at all, and they really grow stale very quickly for me. Don Toliver's croon should be a high point for him usually, but on here he just isn't really standing out vocally. He just sounds like he's half-assing it most of the time, and he just reverts to doing bland Travis Scott impersonations at points here too. He adds more monotony to the bland production, and the features don't help either. Not to mention, Life of a Dawn is kind of bloated as well, with some filler tracks that don't really add anything to the album, and they feel like they're only there just to pad it out. I don't think this album is bad by any means, and it has maybe one or two okay tracks, but I just find it to be so utterly mediocre and uninspired for its 50 minutes, and once again, I'm very underwhelmed and disappointed by a Don Toliver record.
I certainly wouldn't call myself a Don Toliver fan, but he does have a lot going for him. He's got a very unique voice, which in the right setting can be truly powerful. He's just got a very infectious aura around him. And when he delivers the goods, he's definitely one of the most interesting artists in the pop rap sphere today. Unfortunately, the goods are seldom delivered on Life of a Dawn. Similarly to his last project, Heaven or Hell. Just like on that project, I think Dawn is just phoning it in far too often. It just seems so nondescript, so minimal effort, and as you said, unavoidably derivative of Travis Scott at times. It's just it feels like Don is just not able to break from the shackles on his own projects. Clearly, the dude is buckets full of talent. Moon, by the Kanye track he was on, one of the best songs I've heard this year. Outstanding performance from him. He absolutely carries that track. But he just isn't able to replicate that on his own material. Just like you said, Astral, that feature, brilliant. It just, a lot of the time, that aura around him, that quality just isn't present on his own albums, and I think Life of a Dawn definitely suffers from that. There's just so much on this project, and so little of it is worthwhile. It's bloated, it's directionless, and it's too derivative, in my opinion.
I hard agree. Alright, my favourite tracks from Life of a Dawn are What You Need and Double Standards. The worst track is Smoke, and I gave this album a light 4.
My favourite tracks are Swangin' on Westheimer and Crossfaded. My least favourite tracks are 5X, Get Throwed, and Smoke, and I gave this album a light 4.
Moving on, we have Illusory Walls by The World is a Beautiful Place and I'm No Longer Afraid to Die. This is the 5th studio album from the American Midwest emo and post-rock band The World is a Beautiful Place and I'm No Longer Afraid to Die. Illusory Walls is the second album that I've ever heard from the band. The other album that I heard being their sophomore album, Whenever If Ever, which we actually talked about in our emo essentials list. I think that Whenever If Ever was a good album, but nothing that truly blew me away or really stood out to me in the grander scheme of Midwest emo. But I was still intrigued to give more of their work a listen. And lo and behold, a new album came out a few weeks later, and after listening to it, I think it's fine. Illusory Walls sees the band remain in their primary sound of Midwest emo and post-rock, but at times throughout this album we see the band get a little bit more ambitious with, dare I say, proggier tendencies, particularly with the 2 last tracks. And at times this album often borders on just being post-metal, in my opinion. The instrumentation is pretty solid all around, the vocals don't really do too much for me, but they're competent throughout, and the production is decent enough on its own. Plus, I think that there are genuinely some fantastic tracks on this album, especially the lengthy final 2 tracks, which are undeniably amazing. But despite its great qualities, Illusory Walls just misses the mark for me. And, for one, I just feel like a lot of the tracks don't really do much to stand out on their own or make themselves memorable, since we're kind of just handed a bit of plain old Midwest emo and post-rock that doesn't really exhibit much in the way of anything that's really unique or personality-driven. It just feels like they box themselves into Midwest emo cliches every now and then. These specific tracks are decent on their own, but they don't really sound, don't really stand out, to be honest. But the great material on here strikes me, thankfully. So, all in all, I think that Illusory Walls is a solid effort from the band that absolutely has its standout moments, but a lot of the material is just lacking that extra drive, in my opinion, and there's not really too much memorable about them, to be honest.
Anyone who knows me knows how much I adore this band. Their first two projects are some of my favorite emo projects of all time, and their debut, Whenever If Ever, is my second favorite album of the entire last decade. So to say I was hyped for this project would definitely be an understatement, but I made sure to keep expectations modest, as their 27 album, Always Foreign, was a little disappointing when it first released 4 years ago. And while it has grown on me a tiny bit, I still think it's a massive step down in terms of quality and ambition for the band. It certainly wasn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it felt like the band just wasn't there creatively. And it was something that I was worried about going into this project. How creative, how out there, how interesting what they present on this project will be. But you know what? They delivered something I didn't really expect. They definitely take the Midwest emo sound of the first two albums and put it on the back burner in favor of the more post-rocky tendencies of the first two albums. And they just create something very large, very massive, very ambitious, while still, keeping to their usual Midwest emo and just post-rock sensibilities. And it's definitely a step forward, ambitious in terms of ambition, in terms of creativity. It's a lot more interesting than Always Foreign could ever hope to be. I don't quite think it captures the magic of their first two albums, but it's definitely a great album, and it does see the band back, I think, in their element, back creating something larger than life, back creating something really unique in the Midwest emo sphere. As you said, they take an ocean of influences such as prog rock, notably post-metal. I definitely hear a lot of post-metal here. And from start to finish, this album just never fails to excite me, never fails to keep me entertained on the edge of my seat. And it honestly blew my expectations out of the water because, I was a little skeptical going in, but it's not lightning in a bottle like their first album was. It's not as consistent as their second album, but it still, I think, stands as a very good album in what is, in my opinion, a very good discography.
Fair enough, I guess. My favourite tracks from Illusory Walls are Died in the Prison of the Holy Office, Infinite Josh, and If You Were Afraid. My least favourite track is Blank Worker, and I gave this album a strong 5 to a light 6.
My favourite tracks are Queen Sophie for President, Infinite Josh, and If You Were Afraid. Do not have any least favourites. I give this album a strong 8.
Alright, moving on, we have, Jesus Christ, Music of the Spheres by Coldplay. This is the ninth studio album from the UK pop rock band Coldplay. Oh look, it's my favourite band ever. Now, personally, I've never really gotten Coldplay, not even their older material. I just find them to be one of those bands that I just can't really get into, since I find most of their material to just be unapologetically boring. And it doesn't help that since then the band has just become this emotionless shell of a Chris Martin circle jerk. So, with the new album announced and with it having emojis as track titles, I was just not excited one bit. And when I gave it a listen, I unsurprisingly didn't like this album. In fact, I think it's pretty bad all in all. Higher Power and Coloratura aren't bad tracks particularly, unlike the rest of the album, but they still don't really do much for me, and I found them pretty boring. The rest, though, is just painfully flavourless, overproduced, void of any emotion, and are just straight up boring. The synth pop all over this album is incredibly bland, often very compressed. Some of the odd choices, like on tracks like Beautiful, are just annoying as hell. Chris Martin sounds just as uninspired as he is bored, and there's just very little about his performances that are likable, to be honest. It has a space-inspired concept as well, but the concept is about as interesting as the music itself, so make that what you will. I have nothing else to add here. This is just flat, lifeless, and a dull bore of an album that doesn't do anything to sway my opinions on the band previously. And in my opinion, it fucking sucks.
This new Coldplay album is some of the most inoffensive music I've ever heard in my life. It's so polished, so sterile, and just so nondescript that it just feels like this album never happens. You listen through it and you just don't know what you've heard. Nothing sticks. Everything is just pastiche to the max. It's it's a painful listen in that it's just hard to even remember anything that happened here. Coldplay are genuinely just a shell of a band at this point. I think the final track, Colourgrade, which is the only track, I don't even think it's great, but it's the only track worth a damn on this entire thing. I think just their Pink Floyd inspired wankery just hypnotized everyone, and I think somehow got people's hopes up. But no, nothing on this album even remotely lives up to that track. It's boring. It just goes by without, bringing anything new, interesting to the table. This album just kind of happens and then it goes away. In 1 year, out the other, whatever. Coldplay are just a shell of a band.
Just a bit of fucking shit in it. Alright, best tracks off of, what's this album called again? Oh, Music of the Spheres. Higher Power and Colourgrade. The worst track is Beautiful. Fuck, that song is annoying. And I gave this album a decent 3.
My favorite track is Colourgrade. My least favorite tracks are Let Somebody Go and Beautiful. I give this album a strong 3.
Based. Alright, next up we have Optimist by FINNEAS. Did I just say Optimist like Optimus Prime? Fuck my life. Okay, so this is the debut album from California producer and singer-songwriter FINNEAS. Now, I'm sure that I'm not alone in saying that I've only really been familiar with FINNEAS through his work with his sister, Billie Eilish, since he writes and does the production for her, and he's a very talented producer and songwriter, might I add. He's one of the key factors in why the 2 Billie Eilish albums are as solid and as great as they are. I never listened to any of FINNEAS' solo work, so I didn't really know what kind of vibe that he would be going for or what he would do in a solo setting, so I was curious. Unfortunately, though, Optimist is far from a great record, good, or even a decent record. In fact, I think it's pretty mediocre. For one, I just feel like what FINNEAS tried to do on here wasn't fleshed out at all, and it feels like a huge setback for him in terms of writing and production. Like, the whole album just sounds very rough and very ill-conceived from start to finish. I feel like FINNEAS' vocal range is I guess just average at best. Well, range is wrong way to say, but it's just his vocals aren't really that great. His songwriting is often quite awkward and maybe at times just a little corny. A lot of the ideas that he tries to put forth on here are often just really basic and unadventurous. His production choices and sonic direction are rough, just very bland. I guess I can kind of respect it for not being a total copy-paste of what he normally does with Billie, but Christ, this was so sterile and predictable all the way through. It's a really forgettable album all around with not really any tracks that are all that memorable or interesting. It's a bit of an in 1 ear out the other type situation, and as much as I like FINNEAS' work normally, this just wasn't very good. It was quite disappointing for me. Ultimately, it's a pretty mediocre debut, and it does very little to suffice.
Listen, I absolutely admire FINNEAS as a producer, and he's certainly one of the most talented and exciting in the world right now. And as you said, his contribution to what makes Billie Eilish such a special artist cannot be understated, as he has such a large part to play in her albums and in her success. But the solo album from him just isn't good. When looking at how driven and unique the production on Billie's work is, and just how well it gels with Billie's performances, this just falls completely flat. Production-wise, this is just serviceable at best. It just doesn't have that signature flair that Billie's work does. It doesn't do anything interesting. It just plays things far too safe. And vocally, I guess FINNEAS is alright, but he certainly doesn't really stand out as much as he just kind of gets the job done. Lyrically, though, is where this album definitely loses me the most. It's just so poorly written, so all over the place. There isn't a single track on here that jumps out at me as particularly good or exciting or well written. It's just moment after moment which just misses the landing entirely. It's an absolute mess of an album from a man who has already proven to be one of the most talented people in music today. So yeah, it's just disappointing, really.
Yeah, you got that right. So my favorite tracks from Optimist are How It Ends in a Concert in 6 Months From Now, My least favourite tracks are Love is Pain and Hurt Locker, and I gave this album a decent to strong 4.
My favorite tracks are none of them. My least favorite tracks are The Kids Are All Dying, The 90s, and Love is Pain. I give this album a light 3 out of 10.
Oh shit, I forgot about that fucking 90s song. Jesus Christ. Right. So, next up we have Punk by Young Thug. This is the second studio album from Atlanta rapper, singer-songwriter, and one of trap's biggest innovators, Young Thug. Punk is coming out 2 years after Thugger's debut, So Much Fun, which for me was very much represented by the title. Fucking hell, I can't speak. Since, honestly, it was one of his funnest and catchiest records, all in all. You know, Thugger generally is one of my favourite artists in the trap lane, since he's very innovative, I love his vocal style, and he has personality, so I will always anticipate a Young Thug release when it's announced, and that was the case for Punk. Now, his Tiny Desk concert hinted at him going in a heavily guitar-based direction, and a somewhat singer-songwriter lane, which for me is pretty interesting, and I was intrigued with where he would go with this sound in mind. After listening to it though, I can't really say that Punk is one of Thugger's shining moments, and I feel like it's one of his weakest moments thus far. Now, as far as positives go, I do have a few. I think that the direction Thugger is going in is incredibly admirable and respectable. I think that it's cool to see what artistic direction he had in mind, and it leads to some pretty solid moments at times, like the opening track especially, and there's some really cool guest performances on here from Mac Miller and Gunna, surprisingly. But unfortunately, Punk is just such an incredibly flawed record in a lot of ways. For one, I just feel like Thugger is not really performing to the best of his ability past the first few tracks. It just seems like he's on autopilot a lot of the time, especially on the more trap-centered cuts. The album just kind of ends up losing itself in unmemorable trap pastiche. There's plenty of weak guests on a lot of these tracks, and the album is just padded out with so much filler, and the production is honestly quite bland and forgettable past the first few moments. You know, generally it's just an album where Young Thug just loses focus in his direction, in my opinion. It just reverts back to the typical sound for him, and I wish that the album was a lot shorter and able to flesh itself out more with what I tried sonically. And while I obviously respect it, I just feel like it ends up getting lost in tropes and bland do-nothing instrumentals and production. Now, as much as I love Thugger, this wasn't very good, and this is one of his weakest albums in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. For an album that has been in the works and teased for 3 years, Punk just feels just strangely undercooked and unrefined. Thugger has always been one of the most unique voices in the current hip-hop scene, but that unique voice is, for the most part, nowhere to be found on Punk. It's an album that just is completely lackluster and ditches Thugs.
Tug. You're gone pure culture now.
Oh god. Where was I? Oh yeah, it ditches Tug's signature playful and quirky dynamic for very unremarkable and very accessible pop rap. And while, you know, there's nothing really offensively bad about this project, it just really does nothing to stand apart from the crowd. And, you know, it feels like Thugger is hiding his personality on here and his quirkiness in favor of something tasteless and inoffensive just to the max. It's probably a low point in Thug's career. It's just not worth the wait. It thankfully wasn't on my radar. I wasn't aware that this was an album that was even in the works all that time. But anyone who was waiting eagerly for this, I'm sorry. I feel bad.
Oh, poor Nas. Oh my god. Alright, my favorite tracks from Punk are... Hold on, let me get them here. Alright, my favorite track from Punk is Die Slow, and the others I liked are Stupid Asking and Day Before. Worst tracks are Icy Hot and Yeah, 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 and I gave this album a decent 4.
My favorite track is Love You More. My least favorite tracks are Stupid Asking and Scoliosis. I gave this album a light 4.
Alright, next up we have Volcanic Bird Enemy and The Voiced Concern by Lil Ugly Mane. This is the 8th studio album from rapper, singer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist and producer Travis Miller under the Lil Ugly Mane name. Now, it took me a good while to really get into Lil Ugly Mane. I didn't think much of his sound when I first got recommended stuff like Mr. Thug Isolation, but once he clicked, he fucking clicked hard. Now, I was more so familiar with Lil Ugly Mane's very early catalogue, which was heavily inspired by Memphis rap, chopped and screwed, cloud rap, and jazz rap. Uneven Compromise especially has become one of my favourite EPs of all time, and I've been meaning to give so much more of Lil Ugly Mane's work a listen. Well, this new album is out here. It's the first proper Lil Ugly Mane album in 6 years. I know Travis has music under, plenty of different pseudonyms, so that'll explain why. But for now, new Lil Ugly Mane music is here, and his newest album is honestly really fucking great to me. I think that it's such a great and interesting album. Volcanic Bird Enemy and the Voice Concern, much like the album cover, is just strange. But there's something to love about the strangeness. This album is all over the place when it comes to where Travis pulls his influences from. Where you see, sounds of trip hop, hypnagogic pop, folk, and neo-psychedelia, as well as indie rock being brought into the mix. But the only thing really tying them together cohesively is the fact that the instrumentals are plunderphonic. That's it. Some of the samples that he pulls from are very odd, to say the least, some of which are very cartoonish, but the way he utilizes these samples gives them a sense of eeriness and dread. It's really morbid and weird, to say the least, but that morbid feeling is only added by Travis's performances, which is mostly just very subdued singing from him. He may be a limited voice when it comes to singing, but the vulnerability he displays is honestly quite captivating, and it's surreal when combined with instrumentals that are just as captivating and surreal. And, obviously the lyricism on this album is just very dark, morbid, and depressive as well, and it kind of adds a lot to the project for me. There may be moments on this album where it doesn't fully click with me, or maybe moments that don't really engage me, but most of this album is just incredibly captivating in its morbid mood, strange sound palette, dark performances, and experimentation. This was just a pleasant surprise for me. I haven't really delved that far into Lil Ugly Mane's discography, like I mentioned, but I can already tell this will be an album to remember in the long run, and it's easily one of the strangest listens that I've had all year, to say the least. So, yeah, I think this album is great, and yeah.
Yeah, this one definitely caught me off guard. And what a left turn. After waiting 6 years for a new Lil Ugly Mane album, I'm not sure many people could have expected Travis to return with one of the most exciting and eclectic psychedelic / hypnagogic pop albums I've ever heard. This thing throughout is just a work of genius. The whole atmosphere, the emotional delivery of this project feels like a quarantine fever dream. Lyrically, it's just depressing, it's dark. Vocally, it borders on lethargic, but in a way that feels like it adds to the emotion and to the just depressive qualities of the music. It almost feels like a cry of help from a man just alone and isolated with his emotions. But it's what happens around those lyrics and those vocals that make this album special. This album is an absolutely idiosyncratic and awe-inspiring journey through genre after genre, masterfully executed sample after masterfully executed sample, mellow and hauntingly beautiful composition after mellow and hauntingly beautiful composition. Every second of this album is just so unique. It's almost surreal. Surreal. It's just so hypnotically unique in its delivery, in its performances, in its production. It's just an absolutely genius album. It's honestly one of the best and most memorable quarantine albums of all time. I think when I look back at this period in time, this is definitely going to be one of those albums that, stands out and represents this period perfectly. It's one of the most addictive and unique listening experiences of the year, and I absolutely love it.
Same here. My favourite tracks from Volcanic Bird Enemy and The Voice Concern are Benadryl Submarine, Beach Harness, Into a Life, VPN, and Cursor. My least favourite track is Stock Car, and I gave this album an 8 out of 10.
My favourite tracks are Benadryl Submarine, Cold in Here, and Porcelain Slightly. I do not have any least favourite tracks. I give this album a strong 8.
Next up, we have Blue Banisters by Lana Del Rey. This is the 7th studio album from American singer-songwriter Lana Del Rey. Lana is quickly following up her previous album Chemtrails Over the Country Club only around 8 months later. Chemtrails was a decent album for what it's worth, but it felt like a weak follow-up to what I consider her best album, Norman fucking Rockwell. It just felt like Lana didn't really... Sorry. Okay, sorry, bitch. Right. All right, Norman fucking Rockwell. It was the album that preceded Chemtrails, and Chemtrails just felt like Lana not really progressing that much, and there were just so many shoddy moments of production and vocals at points. Plus, with the new album out already, I was more or less expecting this album to be just another set of B-sides and leftovers. After listening to it, though, I can safely say that it doesn't really feel like B-sides, and it has its highlights, but it just misses the mark in terms of memorability. I like this album about as much as her last album, should I say. But I think it has more highlights, personally. Lana sounds like she's trying to do a bit more passionate vocals. The direction of this album takes away a lot of the predominantly folky elements in favor of a more soft rock and piano rock setting. Her lyricism, while at times suffering from the usual crack with Lana cringe, it's mostly inoffensive and actually solid at times, and while it does feel like a bit of a mess at times, I won't deny there's some seriously good songs on this thing. But like Chemtrails, Blue Banisters is just more or less the same. It just kind of feels inoffensive, full of tracks that are decent but nothing amazing. It's just Lana doing her thing, but still suffering from a lack of memorability. I think it's one of Lana's better albums still, but for what it's worth, it lacks the flair that I loved about Norman fucking Rockwell. Apologies for the cussing. So, this album it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, pretty much. I think everything in Lana's career led up to Norman fucking Rockwell in 2019.
Hey, swearing!
Normal fudging Rockwell. And since then, her sound has just slightly stagnated. Chemtrails Over the Country Club was just honestly an artistic step back for her, and an overall safer, less fleshed out, and less anthemic album. And Blue Banisters, I think, once again follows in the footsteps of Chemtrails in that it just doesn't have the level of attention to detail, the passion, just the all-around creativity that normal fudging rock had.
Okay, you can swear now. You can swear now. Never say that again. Oh, God.
Kids, click off. It's just a more stripped back and atmospheric project, and while Lana can certainly carry a track with just her vocals alone, it's the lush and gorgeous instrumentation on Rockwell that brought it to another level. The instrumentation here on Blue Banisters is just, it's palatable. Nothing really stands out that much. Nothing really stands out as bad either. And, I think a lot of the emphasis does go to Lana's vocals, which, again, are good, but I don't think that alone is enough for this album to be anything spectacular and memorable. It's solid. If you like Lana Del Rey, I'm sure this will be an enjoyable listen, but just like Chemtrails, it doesn't really progress her sound further. And also, what the fuck was the trap remix of the song from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly about?
Oh, yeah.
I don't think I've laughed harder at a song this year, and this was the last album I expected to fucking piss myself laughing at. I still don't know what the fuck that was.
Dude, it caught me so off guard. It was the funniest fucking thing I've ever heard, intertwined on this soft rock album. It was so
it's just
stupid.
It's a moment of just pure comedic genius. I don't know if it's intentional, but just out of nowhere. It's weird.
I think Lana Del Rey's a fucking comedic genius. Let's go.
What the fuck was that?
Honestly, Jesus.
I'm still recovering
Christ.
from that.
I'm still laughing thinking about it. Fucking hell. Okay, alright, moving on. For my favorite tracks on Blue Banisters are Arcadia, Blue Banisters, and Textbook. The worst track is The Trio, and I gave this album a decent 6.
What the fuck? Alright, my best track is The Trio. I'm joking. My best track is Blue Banisters, Steeler, and Sweet Carolina. My least favorite track is Living Legend. I'm not going to throw The Trio in there. It was too fucking funny. I gave this album a strong 6.
Okay, bud. Alright, moving on, we have Sympathy for Life by Parquet Courts. This is the 8th studio album from New York post-punk and dance punk band Parquet Courts. Parquet Courts are back well over 3 years since their last album, the critically acclaimed Wide Awake, which is a fantastic album. It's easily one of the wildest and funnest dance punk records, period. And when the band announced that a new album was coming out, I was pretty damn excited to hear. I put off listening to it for a week once it came out since I was busy with other shit, and when I saw the majority of people saying that this was kind of underwhelming, it kind of crushed my soul, to say the least. So after that, I was dreading the worst, but after giving it a listen, I'm kind of fucking with this album, and honestly, for me, it's gotta be one of the most underrated albums of the year. Sure, Sympathy for Life may not be as exciting or as off the wall as Parquet Court's last album, Wide Awake, was, but I still found a lot of what the band did on this album to be incredibly catchy, performed well, and generally just kind of fun. A lot of the material past the first couple of tracks here sounds like a dead ringer for something Talking Heads would have done back in the day. But if you know me, I fucking love Talking Heads, and a lot of the tracks in this are just simply just too infectious to ignore. Parquet Courts thrive in the grooves once again, but it also features some really good guitar work, really good production, and just some really good ideas like on Applications Apparatus or on Plant Life. It just comes off pretty tight and well thought out in my opinion, and I just can't, I don't know, I just can't help but feel like what the band did instrumentally is just really fun and just incredibly groovy. They embraced the groove on this, and I don't know, I was kind of fucking with the grooves, if you ask me. There's definitely some snoozers, but for the most part, I just can't help but enjoy a lot of the material on Sympathy for Life. I think that it takes some interesting directions, and the tracks on here just did the right amount for me. So yeah, I guess I'm one of the few people fucking with the new Parquet Courts album, and I think it's got some great stuff on it in my opinion. And honestly, this album, it's probably going to go down as, like, in my opinion, the most underrated album of the year. So yeah.
God, you're so fucking lucky.
Wait, what? Wait, what?
You're so lucky. I wish I enjoyed this. I was so hyped.
Fuck you.
But it just, I am just disappointed. I don't know what else to say. Wide Awake was just an adrenaline rush from start to finish. It was just a very playful and tongue-in-cheek take on political rock, which just packed punch after punch after punch with its rhythmic instrumentation, with its just unrelenting energy. And Sympathy for Life just completely pales in comparison to me. This album is just lethargic. It goes for a more heavily post-punk influenced sound, and it just gives up a lot of the charisma, a lot of the energy, and a lot of the magic of the previous works for something that just sounds not very unique in the current soundscape and just sounds tired and lethargic. It just does not sound anywhere near as passionate, and the ideas here just oftentimes are okay and serviceable, but it just doesn't have that playful cathartic energy of their previous works. It just kind of drags on, little stands out, and it just doesn't excite me in any way. I think it's a throwaway album. I think there's plenty of better albums in this vein out there, and I think the band had a very unique place within that punk sphere, and it just kind of feels like they've given it up for something more safer and accessible on here, and I'm just personally disappointed.
Fucking boo, man. Jesus. Well, looks like Mick's alone again. Anyways, my favourite tracks from Sympathy for Life are Marathon of Anger, Plant Life, Applications Apparatus, and Sympathy for Life. My least favourite track is Black Widow Spider, and I gave this album a strong 7 to a light 8.
My favourite track is Walking at a Downtown Pace. My least favourite track is Black Widow Spider, and I gave this album a decent 4.
Oh, that's too low.
I know.
Okay. I would have settled for a 5, but you do you, I guess. Alright, so... Alright, next up we have Shade by Grouper. This is the 4th studio album from American producer, singer, and songwriter Liz Harris, aka Grouper. Now, we talked about Grouper previously in our Genre Essentials episode on ambient music, and Liz made it onto that list with AIA Alien Observer, which is a fantastic album, but it's one of the only albums in the Grouper discography that I've heard. It's pretty good timing when that episode came out, since Grouper was just releasing a new album entitled Shade, and I was pretty interested to hear what Liz was going to do on this one, but after giving it a listen, it's just not really my thing, to be honest. A lot of what Liz does on here is set in a kind of lo-fi contemporary folk setting, and while there's some very serene and mellow soundscapes and vocals to be found on here, I can't help but find a lot of the material to be kind of dull and unmemorable. Plus, it feels kind of one-dimensional too. The sound just feels a little bit too sleepy for me. There's nothing really grabbing my attention with the sound palette, and I don't really find it all that engaging or memorable. Like, it's pleasant, but nothing that's really grabbing me or intriguing me. I will say, the final track is great and easily the highlight of the album for me, but I have to sit through the rest of this very hazy and sleepy bit of lo-fi contemporary folk, which just isn't great to me to get to that great song. Now, as a whole, the album isn't bad. I don't think there's a bad song on here, but what we have on here is just nothing that good to me, and I found it to be a bit of a bore, to say the least.
I disagree. I don't think anyone is able to combine the intimate sounds of folk with ambient atmospheres quite like Liz Harris does, and she once again proves that on her new project Shade. Grouper has showcased some diverse soundscapes and ideas throughout the year, but one thing everything she releases has in common is just how warm, how comforting and meditative her music is. And Shade is in no way, shape or form an exception, and perhaps her most intimate project to date. Her gentle guitar strumming just bleeds through the dense atmospheres perfectly. Her angelic vocals just ring out among walls of ambience and droning. And this album is just, it feels kind of like a safe space, like hiding away in your bed on a rainy day. It just feels like, a little tiny speck of just comfort and safety among chaos and just denseness and confusion, and it just sounds beautiful. It sounds perfect. I love the atmospheres on here, and I don't think there's any other group or project which just sounds quite this intimate, where you can make out the guitars quite this much, where you can make out the vocals quite this much. It feels just so comforting and fantastic. It's a very good project.
Wrong. Anyways, my favorite tracks from Shade are Kelso, and my least favorite track is Basement Mix, and I gave this album a decent 5.
My favorite tracks, sorry, my notes just scrolled. My favorite tracks are Unclean Mind, Pale Interior, and The Way Her Hair Falls. My least favorite track is Followed by the Ocean. I gave this album a light 7.
Okay, we're moving on to the last set of albums that we have for the month, and we're going to talk about LP by JPEGMAFIA. This is the 4th studio album from rapper, singer, and producer JPEGMAFIA. LP is also coming out around 2 years after his last proper album, All My Heroes Are Cornballs, which we actually got to talk about in our experimental hip-hop essentials, but it also happens to be my favourite album from Peggy at this point in time. Now, I'm a big Peggy fan, so I was excited to see what we were getting in an album now. What the fuck am I saying? What the fuck? I'm a Peggy fan, so I was excited to see that, we were getting a new album from him so soon after dropping those EPs, one of which came out this year, if I remember correctly. There's 2 versions of the album. The online version, which is, the one you can get on general streaming services, and the offline version, which you can get on Bandcamp or YouTube. But, we want to cover the offline version specifically, since we think that it's the better version of the album, and it feels like the version that Peggy truly wanted to make. And, time to ask the question. Is it good? Well, fuck yeah, it is. I think it's really great. LP is more or less a culmination of everything that he's done over the past few years. The sheer unpredictability of Veteran, the catchier pop and R&B melodies of All My Heroes Are Cornballs, or the banger factor of EP, and the lo-fi cloudiness of EP2. They can all be found here, and Peggy does a great job on both production and performance ends of things. Peggy just proves that he's a fucking banger factory on this album, with tracks that are just hard-hitting, infectious, and chock full of the same personality, commentary, and quotables that I love Peggy's music for. The hard-hitting production throughout LP is just very audacious, colourful, and varied. Peggy showcases some really great ideas, some slick sampling to get some slick sampling to go along with the tracks. Peggy's lyrics are still great on this album. He continues to showcase the flamboyant snark and commentary that's more so a trademark for him at this stage, and most of the tracks just go off for me. My only problem with LP is that it's a tad bit front-loaded, and there's a few tracks towards the back end that I don't really care for, in contrast with the others that I think are just great. 20 tracks doesn't really feel all that necessary, to be honest, and despite it not being my favourite Peggy album, I think it's another great highlight in his career. So yeah, I thought this was great. I promise I'm not biased.
First things first, just as you said, listen to the offline version. This is the definitive version of this album. It's just, the online version, I probably will never listen to again. But anyways, now that we're talking about the actual album, I think as a whole it's definitely good. It definitely has, everything you look for in a JPEGMAFIA album, which admittedly it's a very broad statement, because Peggy does a lot. He does a lot, and just like he always does, he delivers just a very eclectic and just chaotic and wild array of sounds on LP. And honestly, I definitely really enjoyed this album, but it's probably my least favorite JPEGMAFIA album of the three. Don't get me wrong, I think the direction Peggy takes this album in is certainly interesting, and it may very well be the hardest to pin down out of all the albums, for better or for worse. It's got moments which just stand high among his discography. End credits is just fantastic, and unlike anything I've ever heard, period. Hazard Duty Pay is probably the best song he's ever released, in my opinion. But there's just moments on this album that feel a little cluttered, feel a little forgettable, and almost too messy for their own good. I do think it's the least consistent of JPEGMAFIA's projects, and while I do think that there's definitely I see a lot of potential in this album to grow on me over the years, it definitely feels like one of those projects that I'm not going to gravitate towards straight away. It's just, at this moment in time, I think it's good. I think at times it's a little overwhelming for its own sake, and not every moment sticks the landing, but I do think that this might grow on me in time, and it's certainly a project I would recommend to anyone.
It better fucking grow on you. Alright, my favourite tracks are Trust, Dirty, Hazard Duty Pay, What Kind of Rapping Is This, Thoughts Prayer, OG, Dikembe, and Tired, Nervous and Broke. My least favourite track is Damn 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 and BMT, and I gave this album a light 8.
My favourite tracks are End Credits, Hazard Duty Pay, and Dikembe. My least favourite track is 100, and I give this album a strong 6 to a light 7. I cannot decide yet.
Okay, please give it a 7. I bet. Alright, next up we have Equals by Ed Sheeran. This is the 5th studio album from English singer-songwriter and one of the world's most massive artists right now, Ed Sheeran. Now, Ed Sheeran is one of those artists who I just straight up don't like, for lack of better words. His music to me is just far too boring, shallow, and purposeless. Like, all Ed even does these days is play to the mainstream market to the point where he just becomes very overplayed and intolerable. And I try my due diligence to just avoid his music, but, since we're a music podcast, it's our job to find content, and Equal is our content for today. And wouldn't you know, I think it sucks. If you didn't like Ed Sheeran already, then Equal sure as fuck won't change your mind about him. This album is just more of the same music that he made on albums like Divide. It's just more of the same mediocre pop with folk, dance pop, and now synth pop being thrown into the mix. The music itself, once again, is just very dry, plain, basic, and Ed accompanies that with a lot of songwriting that does feel cliched, bland, and uninspired. But I will give this album credit. There are moments where it does come off like Ed is very genuine and just very what's the word? I can't think of it, but just no. I think there are moments where he definitely it feels human, to say the least. And honestly, it doesn't start off too bad with the opening track, but after that, it just kind of drives itself off a cliff, and then kind of like, I don't know, just fucking dies in the car crash. Honestly, I don't dislike Equals as much as Divide or his last collaborations album, but that's not saying much. I still think it's just mediocre and boring. I don't have anything else to say about Equals. If you've ever heard his hits over the past few years, then you've pretty much heard this. Yeah.
Ed Sheeran, the biggest pop star in the world for over a decade now, releases yet another album of just lowest common denominator pop, inoffensive, garbage tier pop music. And let's face it, the whole world stands and applauds because that's all Ed Sheeran ever does, and that's all he's ever gotten popular for. Look, Ed Sheeran serves a specific purpose. If not for him, what else would you play in fucking grocery stores and clothes shops throughout the world? It's not music that you really want in an album format. It just feels like a compilation of just poorly written, for the most part, inoffensive pop tracks. I admittedly think that Ed Sheeran is talented, and I am one of the few people who will stand and defend his debut from 2011, because I think that project is very sincere, very intimate, and is genuinely one of the better pop albums of the early 2010s, especially when it comes to just very mainstream pop. But his music has just been anything but sincere since that album, anything but intimate. And I think this album again just is just so obviously written by people who are anything but Ed Sheeran. It just follows pop trope after pop trope and just does not even attempt to hide it. It's Ed Sheeran. What else can I say? It's an album made by a marketing team to sound as ooh as possible. And I will say, however, that the first track genuinely caught me off guard, because one of the better pop tracks I've heard all year, in my opinion. And unfortunately, nothing else lives up even remotely. But yeah, I mean, it's Ed Sheeran. It's music made for people who don't really listen to music as a hobby, let's face it.
True. My favourite track is Tides. The worst tracks are Bad Habits and Shivers, and I gave this album a strong 3.
My favorite track by far is Tides, but Be Right Now was also decent. My least favorite tracks are Shivers, The Joker and the Queen, and Sandman, and I gave this album again, can't really decide between a strong 2 and a light 3, but I'll find a good score for it in time.
Time will tell. Right. So next up we have Hushed and Grim by Mastodon. This is the 8th studio album from the American progressive and sludge metal band Mastodon. Now, I haven't listened to everything that Mastodon have put out, but in fact, Hushed and Grim is the second album that I've heard from the band. You know, the first being their second album, Leviathan, which is a fucking great album, easily one of the best sludge metal records out there. Now, I know that a lot of Mastodon's later output isn't exactly their most liked, so I wasn't really expecting much going into this album here, and after giving it a listen, I can't really say that I found much enjoyable about Hushed and Grim. Mastodon just sound like zombies at this point, because there's just barely a pulse to the dead music that we find on Hushed and Grim. Like, the band are clearly very talented musicians, but they just come up with... But what they come up with on here just sounds so dry, bland, and just very uninspired. The production comes off very balanced and clean in the mix, initially, but the mix on the drums is just really fucking dodgy, to say the least. Mostly because, they're often just so quiet in the mix, and they're just mixed so low, but then the kick drum is, the loudest fucking thing imaginable. The guitar work is just very dry and limp. You can barely hear the bass on this thing. The vocal lines all over this album are just incredibly hit or miss. The majority of the songs in this album sound just very passionless, lifeless, and uninspired, and just incredibly boring. They just sound like a lesser man's Dream Theater, and I don't even like Dream Theater. There's maybe one song that is decent, but the rest ranges from just boring to painfully boring. Also, the biggest turn-off for this album is the fact that it's 80 minutes long. It absolutely does not even need to be 40 minutes long. Jesus fucking Christ. Honestly, I don't have anything else to say about Hushed and Grim. It's needlessly long, it's very boring, and it offers very little to justify its runtime or for you to actually listen to it, because holy shit, it fucking bores.
Yep, I think everything you said is spot on, and this new Mastodon album just sound like a shell of their former selves. It has so few memorable moments in a sea, and an overly long sea of just mind-numbingly derivative, unimaginative, and unmemorable tracks. It's really quite a hard album to sit through. I do think there is some genuinely fantastic tracks, but it's an album that I don't see myself coming back to ever, simply because of the just amount of just mid songs that you have to sit through. It's well over an hour of just mostly one note stoner prog metal, and I guess if you're a diehard fan of Mastodon or a prog metal, you may certainly find something worthwhile in this project. But for someone who has just no real bias towards any of those genres, I just see this as a completely unoriginal project from start to finish, lacking any real qualities, that would captivate you, that would entice you, that would blow you away like Mastodon's earlier work has. I've never listened to a full project from the group. I have certainly heard plenty of tracks, and I think more so than ever I really need to do them a favor and listen to some of their older projects, because I know that this is far from where the band once were.
Yeah, you should definitely give Leviathan a listen. That one is great. All right, so my favorite track on Hushed and Grim is Sickle and Peace. The worst track is Gobblers of Dregs, and I gave this album a light 4.
My favorite tracks are Sickle and Peace, The Beast, and Gigantium. My least favorite track is Gobblers of Dregs, and I give this album a light 5.
Okay, we're moving on to the final album in today's recap, and this one, I need to warn you all, because this is probably the scariest album that we've ever had to cover, and the fact that it came out on Halloween makes it even scarier. And, of course, the album that we are going to be talking about is Still Sucks by Limp Bizkit. How many albums are they in now? I don't even know. I didn't write anything down.
Who knows?
God knows. God knows how many amazing albums that they've made, but they're only adding another amazing one to their already amazing discography. I mean, what can I say about Limp Bizkit that no one has ever said before? They are the best band of all time. They have made some of the best albums of all time. Chocolate Starfish in the hot dog flavored water, fucking slapper of an album if you ask me. Fred Durst, best rapper of all time. Kendrick could never. And the guitar work is just so meaty and beefy. But also, they're very talented. They can do really sad song, and it's just very good. Very good. So, yeah, all in all, yeah, this album's a 10 out of 10. What can I say?
Yeah, man. You know what? I listened to this project once, and it just made me so emotional, and I cried, and I'm probably never going to listen to this album again, because it's just a reminder that music will never get better than this. So in a way, I wish I could unhear it. It's just that perfect.
Honestly, best track, all of them. Worst tracks, none of them. Score, 10 out of 10.
Yeah, 10 out of 10.
Epic. Thank you, Daddy Durst. You truly are the king of dad vibes. Let's go.
Hell yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we did it. We talked about every album that we wanted to talk about today. So yeah, do you want to move on to best worst albums?
Fuck yeah.
Alright, so we're gonna start with the worst albums actually. So for my number 3, I chose Equals by Ed Sheeran.
For my number 3, I chose Punk by Young Thug.
My number 2, I chose Colourgrade by Tirzah.
My number 2 is Ed Sheeran, Equals.
My number 1 is Music of the Spheres by Coldplay.
My number 1 is FINNEAS, Optimist.
Alright, now we're moving on to our best album segment, and all 5 of them are Still Sucks by Limp Bizkit. Nah, just nah. My number 5 is Talk Memory, Bad Bad Not Good.
My number 5 is Shade by Grouper.
My number 4 is Sympathy for Life, Parquet Courts.
My number 4 is Talk Memory by Bad Bad Not Good.
My number 3 is LP by JPEGMAFIA.
My number 3 is Illusory Walls by The World is a Beautiful Place and I Am No Longer Afraid to Die.
My number 2 is Volcanic Bird, Enemy and the Voice Concern by Lil Ugly Mane.
My number 2 is also Volcanic Bird, Enemy and the Voice Concern by Lil Ugly Mane.
And my number 1, my favourite album of October, is Still Sucks by Limp Bizkit. No. It's Mercurial World, Magdalena Bay.
Ditto.
Fuck yeah, dude. Hey, so we're moving on to our best songs of the month, and these are a couple of my honorable mentions. We have Hazard Duty Pay by JPEGMAFIA. We have VPN by Lil Ugly Mane. But my favorite track of the month is Secrets Your Fire by Magdalena Bay.
Again, I've a fair bit of honorable mentions, like I always do. Firstly, Tides by Ed Sheeran, actually.
Jesus
The
Christ.
Lovely Mane, Cold in Here. New Parano split with Sonus Tonam Conta and Asian Glow. Yeah. The final track off that album, Love Migraine, is incredible. Pale Interior from Grouper's new album. Hazard Due to Pay by JPEGMAFIA. Again, I think it's the best song ever. And Queen Sophie for President by The World is a Beautiful Place. But my favourite track of the month is You Lose by Magdalena Bay.
Woo! And that is going to conclude today's episode of the album's recap for October. Thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We really hope that you enjoyed. As always, the necessary links will be in the description to our Cassette Tapes Discord server, where you can chat and just take the piss with fellow like-minded music nerds like us. Of course, necessary links will be to the Cassette Tapes Twitter, to our own individual channels, as well as our Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages. Be sure to check out some of our older episodes. We do genre essentials, worst to best, etc. And interviews too. And yeah, with that in mind, my name's been Mickey T.
I've been Nostalgia.
See ya!
Peace and love.
I love Limp Bizkit.
Daddy Fred.
Oh, dad vibes.
Daddy vibes.